Welcome back to the Learning Den. You know, every time we do one of these deep dives, I'm amazed at the stories waiting to be uncovered. And today, we're going to journey to the Indian subcontinent, right? During the 18th and 19th centuries. Truly fascinating period.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like a crossroads. The Mughal Empire, which had been such a dominant force, was on the decline, and you had all these regional powers starting to assert themselves. And then there's the British East India Company. They're making their presence felt more and more. And it was definitely a period of uncertainty, a lot of change happening, especially for the Muslim community living there.
And that's precisely where our deep dive takes us today. We're going to look at how religious thinkers within the Muslim community navigated this, well, you could say, tumultuous landscape. It's a question that's really captivating, isn't it? How did they work to guide people, to strengthen their faith, when everything around them was changing so dramatically?
It's a big question, and to tackle it, we're going to be focusing on the efforts and the impact of some really, really prominent religious figures from that era. And by examining their work, we're hoping to uncover how successful they were in spreading Islam during this really uncertain time in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah, it's a story of ideas and movements, of individuals trying to make sense of their world, and in many ways shape the future of their communities. So who are we going to be meeting today?
Well, we'll start with Shah Waliullah, a fascinating figure. He was a reformer of religious thought, someone who really tried to bring Islamic teachings back to their essence, especially in a time when things felt like they were drifting. Then we'll move on to Syed Ahmad Barelvi. He took a much different approach, more focused on action and establishing a truly Islamic state. And finally, we'll explore the work of Haji Shariatullah and his Faraizi movement, which was centered in Bengal and focused on a return to the fundamentals of Islamic practice.
So by the end of this deep dive, the goal is to understand how these individuals shaped the Muslim mindset during this crucial period. And, spoiler alert, their work had implications that reached far beyond their own time. They actually laid the groundwork for some very significant movements that came later.
Oh, absolutely. Their legacy is immense.
So let's start with Shah Waliullah, shall we? Born in Delhi in 1703, he witnessed the decline of the Mughal Empire firsthand. What was the atmosphere like during his lifetime? What were some of the challenges he was grappling with?
Well, imagine a society riddled with political instability. But it wasn't just that. Historical accounts tell us that there was a lot of religious division as well, sectarianism, different groups kind of vying for influence. And on top of that, corruption was rampant. And there was a general sense, at least from some perspectives, of a moral decline. It wasn't a very stable or unified time.
Yeah, a sense of things coming apart. And Shah Waliullah had a really interesting take on this. He saw a direct link between this decline of Muslim rule, right, and what he perceived as a growing disconnect between the Muslim community and the very teachings of Islam. It's as if he felt they had lost their way.
Exactly. He believed that the community had strayed from the core principles, the essence of their faith, and this had contributed to the weakening of their position in society.
And his response to that wasn't to engage in political battles or power struggles. Instead, he focused on reforming religious understanding itself. How did he go about that? What were some of his key strategies?
Well, one of the most significant things he did, and this really had a huge impact, was to translate the Holy Quran into Persian. Now, this might not seem like a big deal to us today, but back then it was a game changer. You see, Arabic was the language of the Quran, the sacred language. But it wasn't the language that most people in the Indian subcontinent spoke or understood.
So most Muslims couldn't access the holy text in their own language. That's a huge barrier.
Right, huge. But Shah Waliullah saw this and realized that by translating the Quran into Persian, a language more widely spoken and understood, he could open up the Word of God to a much, much larger audience. It was a way of making those core teachings accessible to everyday people, allowing them to connect with their faith in a more personal way.
It's like unlocking a door, right?
Yeah.
Making that direct connection possible. And that's really powerful. But it wasn't just about the Quran, was it? He also emphasized other foundational elements of Islamic practice.
Absolutely. He put a lot of emphasis on the Hadith and the Sunnah. These are the traditions and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They provide guidance, really detailed guidance, on how to live a life in accordance with Islamic principles. How to pray, how to interact with others, basically how to put faith into action.
So he was saying, look, we need to go back to the source, to the foundational texts and practices if we're going to revitalize our community.
Exactly. And there's another really important aspect to his work. He was a very outspoken critic of sectarianism. He really disliked the divisions that existed between different Muslim groups.
The infighting, the splitting into faction.
Yeah, that's it. He felt it weakened the community as a whole. And he also spoke out against what he called bid'ah. These are practices that had crept into Islamic tradition over time, but didn't really have a basis in the original teachings.
So innovations that he felt were straying from the true path.
Exactly. And his goal really was to foster unity among Muslims. He wanted to see them come together regardless of their differences and focus on the shared core of their faith.
And that wasn't just an abstract ideal for him, right? It had implications for how society should function as a whole.
Absolutely. From what we understand from historical sources, Shah Waliullah called for a revival of Islamic principles that extended beyond just individual piety. He was very much concerned with justice, fairness, equality, and social welfare. He saw Islam as a guide not only for personal conduct, but also for creating a just and equitable society.
So he had this, like, holistic vision, encompassing both the individual and the social.
Exactly.
But here's where things take an interesting turn, right? He wasn't just an intellectual figure or a spiritual leader. He also engaged with the political realities of his time in a way that some might find surprising.
Yeah, it's an important point. He didn't shy away from the political arena. In fact, when he saw Muslim power weakening and other forces rising up, especially the Marathas, he made a pretty bold decision. He actually invited Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was the ruler of Afghanistan at the time, to invade India.
Wow, that's a major intervention. And this led to the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, which, as historical accounts tell us, did temporarily halt the Maratha advance. But inviting a foreign power into the subcontinent, that's certainly a controversial move, isn't it?
Oh, it definitely is. And historians continue to debate his motivations and the consequences of this decision. But I think it highlights how interconnected he saw the religious and political spheres. For him, the well-being, even the survival of the Muslim community, wasn't just a matter of individual faith. It was tied up with political realities as well.
Yeah, he saw them as two sides of the same coin. And regardless of how we view this particular action, his overall legacy is undeniably huge.
Absolutely massive. His ideas, his writings, his emphasis on core Islamic teachings and the need for unity, they really laid the groundwork for many Islamic movements that emerged later in South Asia. His impact was, well, far-reaching and lasting. He really set the stage for a lot of what came next.
So from this figure who was so influential in shaping religious and even political thought, let's turn our attention to Syed Ahmad Barelvi. He was born in 1786, a generation after Shah Waliullah, and we know he was deeply inspired by Shah Waliullah's ideas. But he took a different path, didn't he? What was his main goal?
Syed Ahmad Barelvi, building on those foundations laid by Shah Waliullah, had a very clear and, some might say, more direct goal. He wanted to establish Islamic rule in the subcontinent. He believed that Muslims should be governed by Islamic law, by Sharia, and that this was the only way to ensure their well-being and the flourishing of their faith.
And he believed this could be achieved through two main avenues, right? Religious reform within the Muslim community, and also, crucially, through military action against non-Muslim rulers.
Exactly. He saw those two things as being interconnected. On the one hand, he wanted Muslims to purify their beliefs and practices, to return to what he considered a pure and unadulterated form of Islam, based strictly on the Quran and the Sunnah. He felt that too many innovations and cultural influences had crept in and needed to be purged.
So that echoes Shah Waliullah's emphasis on going back to the original sources.
It does. But Syed Ahmad Barelvi took it a step further. He believed that true Islamic practice couldn't flourish under non-Muslim rule, so he launched what became known as the Jihad movement.
And this movement was primarily directed against the Sikh Empire in Punjab, which was then under the rule of Maharaja Ranjit Singh.
That's right. He saw Sikh rule as an obstacle to the establishment of a truly Islamic social and political order. He called on Muslims to unite, to fight for their faith and their right to live under Islamic law.
So there's a real sense of urgency, even militancy, in his approach, isn't there? It's not just about studying texts or engaging in quiet reform. It's about taking action, fighting for what he believed was right.
Absolutely. It was a call to arms, both literally and figuratively. He wanted to see a resurgence of Muslim power, a return to a time when they were the dominant force in the subcontinent. And he believed that this required military struggle, jihad.
And his movement was very much a blend of the spiritual and the political, wasn't it? It wasn't just about conquest, it was also about creating a society based on Islamic principles.
Exactly. He envisioned an Islamic state where Sharia law would be the foundation of the legal and social order. And he managed to gather a lot of support, particularly from Pashtun tribes in the northwest frontier province, which is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan.
And he actually went so far as to establish a base of operations in that region, right? He essentially declared an Islamic state.
He did. He set up a base in the area and declared that this was now an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. From there, he and his followers launched a series of attacks against the Sikh armies, trying to gain control of more territory and expand their influence.
But ultimately, his campaign to achieve his goals through military means faced a lot of setbacks, right? It wasn't a straightforward path to victory.
No, it wasn't. The Sikh Empire was a powerful force, and they put up strong resistance. And tragically, Syed Ahmad Barelvi himself was killed in battle in 1831 at the Battle of Balakot. His death was a huge blow to the movement, and while it continued for some time after that, it never really achieved its ultimate objective of overthrowing Sikh rule and establishing a pan-Islamic state.
So in a purely military sense, the jihad movement might be seen as a failure. But its impact went far beyond the battlefield, didn't it? It had this lasting symbolic importance for many Muslims.
Oh, absolutely. Even though it didn't achieve its immediate political goals, it had a profound impact on Muslim consciousness. Syed Ahmad Barelvi became a martyr, a symbol of resistance against what many Muslims saw as oppressive rule. And his movement, even in defeat, inspired a vision of Islam as a complete way of life, encompassing not just personal faith, but also political and social order.
It's like he planted a seed, this idea that Islam wasn't just a set of beliefs, but a blueprint for a just and righteous society.
Exactly. And that seed would continue to grow and influence later generations.
So from this figure who took such a forceful approach to reviving Islamic principles, let's shift our focus now to Bengal and the figure of Haji Shariatullah. He was born in 1781, and his movement, the Faraizi movement, seems to have had a very different character compared to what we've been discussing so far.
You're right, it does have a different flavor. And to understand that, we need to consider Haji Shariatullah's background. He spent a significant amount of time in Mecca, the holiest city in Islam. And while he was there, he was exposed to all sorts of Islamic reform movements that were happening in the heartlands of the Muslim world.
So he was absorbing these ideas of renewal and purification that were circulating at the time.
Yeah, he was soaking it all in. And when he returned to Bengal, he was, well, let's say, a bit dismayed by what he saw. He was deeply concerned by the state of Islamic practice among Bengali Muslims. He felt that many of them had adopted practices and beliefs that were, in his view, un-Islamic. They had incorporated a lot of local superstitions and Hindu cultural influences into their religious lives.
So he saw this blending of traditions, this syncretism, as a problem, a straying from the true path.
He felt that Bengali Muslims had become too influenced by the dominant Hindu culture around them and had lost sight of the core principles of Islam. And this led him to establish the Faraizi movement in the 1820s.
And the name itself, Faraizi, is very telling, isn't it? It refers to the farais, the obligatory duties in Islam. It's right there in the name, his emphasis on getting back to the basics.
It's a very deliberate choice of name. He wanted to focus people's attention on the foundational practices, the things that every Muslim is required to do. So he really emphasized the 5 daily prayers, fasting during Ramadan, the payment of zakat, which is a form of charity, and of course the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca for those who were able to make it.
So he was saying, let's strip away all the extraneous stuff, all the cultural accretions, and focus on what really matters, the core obligations.
Exactly. He wanted to see a return to a more pure and authentic form of Islamic practice, one that was rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, not in local customs or traditions.
And that meant actively campaigning against practices that he considered to have no basis in Islamic teachings, right?
Yeah.
Things like the veneration of saints or the participation in certain local festivals that were seen as being rooted in Hindu traditions.
Yeah, he spoke out against those things. He saw them as innovations, as distractions from the true path. He was really trying to draw a clear line between what he considered authentic Islamic practice and what he saw as cultural influences that had corrupted that practice.
But what makes the Faraizi movement especially interesting, and this is where it perhaps diverges a bit from the other movements we've discussed, is that it wasn't just about religious purification. It also addressed the socioeconomic realities faced by many Muslims in Bengal, particularly the peasantry.
That's a crucial point. Haji Shariatullah was very attuned to the struggles of poor farmers and laborers. He saw how they were being exploited by both Hindu landlords and the British indigo planters who were operating in the region.
So he wasn't just concerned with their spiritual well-being, but also with their material conditions.
Exactly. He saw those two things as being interconnected. He believed that true Islamic practice also involved fighting for justice and fairness in society. And that meant standing up to those who were exploiting the poor and vulnerable.
So he was a religious reformer, but he was also, in a sense, a social activist.
You could say that. He linked religious revival with social justice. He saw them as going hand in hand. And this really resonated with a lot of people, especially the impoverished Muslim peasantry. They saw in him someone who understood their struggles, both spiritual and material, and who offered a path forward.
And his movement gained a lot of traction among those communities. After his death, his son, Dudumian, took over the leadership and continued to build on his father's work.
Yes, Dudumian was a charismatic and effective leader in his own right. He expanded the movement's reach and influence, and he was also very adept at mobilizing people for social and political action. Under his leadership, the Faraizi movement became a force to be reckoned with, both religiously and politically.
And the legacy of the movement is quite significant, isn't it? It's often seen as a key turning point in terms of raising religious awareness among Bengali Muslims and linking that religious awakening with a push for social justice. It really was an early example of this kind of integrated movement in South Asia.
Absolutely. It laid the groundwork for later movements that would combine religious identity with social and political activism. It showed how faith could be a powerful motivator for not just personal piety, but also for collective action aimed at changing the conditions of society.
So when we step back and look at the broader picture, the efforts of Shah Waliullah, Syed Ahmad Barelvi, and Haji Shariatullah, despite their different approaches and regional focuses, they represent this really important period of Islamic revival in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were all responding to the challenges of their time, trying to revitalize their communities in the face of uncertainty and change.
Yeah, it was a time of ferment, of intellectual and social dynamism.
Yeah.
And these three figures, they each played a crucial role in shaping the contours of that dynamism. They operated in different contexts, employed different methods, but they shared this common goal, right? To preserve and revitalize Islam in a world that felt like it was shifting beneath their feet.
And it's interesting how their approaches varied, right? Shah Waliullah focused on intellectual reform, translation, going back to the source text. Syed Ahmad Barelvi took a much more militant approach, believing that armed struggle was necessary to establish Islamic rule. And Haji Shariatullah, while also emphasizing religious purification, linked that very closely to the struggle for social justice and economic fairness.
Yeah, and I think that diversity of approaches is really telling. It speaks to the complexity of the situation, the different ways in which Muslims were trying to make sense of their place in a changing world.
And while they didn't always succeed in achieving their immediate goals, their long-term impact is undeniable. They influenced generations of scholars, reformers, activists, and political leaders. Their ideas continue to resonate and shape the trajectory of Muslim thought and action in the subcontinent.
Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of the region's history. It's impossible to understand the emergence of Pakistan, for example, without acknowledging the contributions of these movements and the ideas they put forward.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways for you? What stands out when you consider the combined impact of these three figures and their movements?
Well, for me, what's really striking is the dynamism and adaptability of Islamic thought and practice. Each of these individuals, in their own unique way, identified challenges facing the Muslim community and offered different paths forward. They drew on core Islamic principles, but they interpreted and applied those principles in ways that were relevant to their specific contexts.
They weren't just copying what had been done before. They were innovating, adapting to the circumstances they found themselves in.
Exactly. And that speaks to the vitality of the tradition, its ability to evolve and respond to changing realities. I think it's a powerful reminder that religious traditions aren't static. They're living things that are constantly being shaped and reshaped by the people who practice them.
Yeah, and that process of shaping and reshaping can be messy, contentious, even violent at times. But it's also incredibly dynamic and creative. It's how traditions stay alive, how they continue to have relevance for people's lives.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's often overlooked, the creative energy that goes into interpreting and adapting religious traditions. It's not just about blind adherence to dogma. It's about engaging with those traditions in a thoughtful and dynamic way, trying to find meaning and guidance for the challenges of the present moment.
So, as we reflect on our exploration today, I think it's clear that these religious thinkers, through their diverse strategies, really left a lasting mark on the religious and social landscape of the Indian subcontinent. They emphasized fundamental Islamic teachings, fostered a sense of unity, ignited movements for social justice, and even inspired political aspirations. Their impact is really undeniable.
And it raises some interesting questions for further exploration, doesn't it? How did the different approaches of these movements, the intellectual reform of Shah Waliullah, the militant zeal of Syed Ahmad Barelvi, and the socio-religious focus of Haji Shariatullah, ultimately shape the future trajectory of Muslim identity and political consciousness in the subcontinent? It's a complex and fascinating interplay of ideas and actions with long-lasting consequences.
And it really makes you wonder, how might the history of the subcontinent have unfolded differently if these influential figures had not emerged and championed their respective visions? It's a thought-provoking question that highlights the profound impact that individuals and their ideas can have on the course of history.
Definitely food for thought.
Well, thank you for joining us in the Learning Den today for this deep dive into a truly fascinating and transformative period in the history of the Indian subcontinent. We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, to delve deeper into the lives of these figures and the movements they led. There's a wealth of knowledge out there waiting to be discovered. And until next time, keep those minds curious and keep exploring.
Absolutely keep learning.
We'll see you back here in the Learning Den soon.
Bye for now.
Bye.